This is JWINK Reviews again, and today I'm going to be reviewing the Sony UBP X800 4K Blu-ray player. And in this case, I'm also going to kind of do a little bit of a comparison to the Sony BDP-S790, which I have above here, which is the previous player that I've owned from Sony. That's about 3 years old. Really, between the two, the major difference between this new 4K player versus the 790 is that this is considered a true 4K player versus the 790, which is a 4K upscaling player. So it's a little bit different in that respect between the two. Now, included here with the new Sony is an instruction manual, which to me is pretty thin and kind of lackluster. It does the basics, but it really is a pretty thin manual. The remote control and, of course, the batteries for the remote. Now, even though the player itself, its manual was pretty thin, the Blu-ray player actually is really quick and easy to set up with my TV. Now, as you can see, I've got it up here and running on screen, but you know, after connecting to the network, my network on this has both wired or wireless capability. I'm using wireless in this case, just mainly because of where it's at. This player immediately notified me of a firmware update, which I recommend, and I always do, that's the first thing I do before doing anything else with any electronic device. I update the firmware on it. Mainly because I think it helps alleviate a lot of the problems that people have early on with these devices. And this particular player probably has been out, I don't know, 6 months to a year now. So there's been some updates that hopefully have worked out some of the bugs that people have complained about this. Now, the firmware itself takes about 5 minutes to update and do. And according to Sony, it's supposed to update and improve the network stability and UHD capability. And this seems to be a common thing with all electronics these days, is the initial firmware that comes out with software, hardware tends to be buggy, then they issue updates. So really, again, I recommend updating this player before you really use it. I do like the fact that this player alerts you right away to a firmware update when you're initially setting things up, and so you can do that immediately. Now, one thing that was weird about it, at least for me, with the firmware setup, is for some reason, though, it actually had me go through the setup again after the update. Although my settings were saved, it did kind of have me go through everything again. At least it did save the settings, though. And as I said here, I've previously been using this Sony 790, BDP-790, that I've been mostly happy with for the last 3 years. But because of the fact that I got a true 4K TV now, I wanted a player that was a true 4K player as opposed to an upscaling player. And which is mainly the reason I got this particular player. Plus, this thing went on sale for about half the price of what it normally runs, which is $300. I caught it on a sale for $149, which is a pretty good deal for this 4K player. Now, as you can tell between the difference physically between the two, this particular player is a bit thicker and a bit heavier than the S790. Mainly, I think it's got a heavier duty frame than the 790. That kind of makes it quieter, I think. And maybe a few more electronics in it than maybe the 790 does in terms of its 4K capability. One thing I like a little bit better about the 790 is I like this tray, smaller tray here versus this one has a tray that kind of it goes all the way across here and flips out. I just think it's kind of a waste of space. But plus, it to me tends to get in the way, and I'll get into that a little bit later. With if you've got a USB cable plugged in, this big tray can tend to get in the way, and the cable can interfere with the tray opening, which I'm, not a big fan of. I think that if that was a little bit more like this design up here with the small tray, I think it would have been a better design, but not a huge issue. One of my issues with the old 790 is that, and for Sony for that matter, and it's probably indicative of all brands really, but is they seemingly have stopped updating the apps on the 790. Even though the player is only about 3 to 4 years old, the apps, for example, the Netflix apps is an older version. They've yet to update it. Whereas this player, the new X800, has the latest app and that has more features, and it's a little bit more user-friendly, the Netflix app on here, than the 790's version. Also, with this old version, the 790, it's been a while since this last firmware update, so I assume Sony's kind of basically stopped updating this player in a way to kind of make you eventually be forced to upgrade to a new one. Another issue that I had with this particular player, the 790, is the difficulty in streaming certain video formats over DLNA or through a NAS. Although it would play most videos through a USB hard drive plugged directly into it, it would refuse to play some formats such as MKV over the network. So when I got this new X800, I was a little bit nervous about this player as well, playing off formats, because it does, in the instruction manual, have a bunch of asterisks saying it may or may not play these formats through DLNA or through streaming, which I'm not really sure why they can't seem to get all these formats, able to stream. You'd think it'd be something they could do relatively easy. Now, I'm currently using a TerraMaster NAS, which there are probably better quality NASs out there that are a little bit more user-friendly with more features, but that's what I have, but it does have several different streaming protocols that can be set to boot up. So I've tried a variety of different formats, such as AVI, MP4, MKV, MPG, and to my surprise, actually, this streamed all of those formats, whereas this 790 here would struggle with the MKVs, for example. So I was surprised it actually worked without an issue. So at least so far, all the formats that I personally use, I've not had any issues with. But again, that may or may not always be the case according to the instructions. I've also connected here, as you can see, I've got a Western Digital external hard drive. This particular one is a 3 terabyte that I've got connected. And one of the improvements that Sony has made with this X800 versus the 790 is the placement of the USB ports now in the front versus the back for the 790 here. My only minor complaint is, again, because of the tray design, that where it's located can kind of get in the way. So it might have been better placed on the side, or again, maybe they should have just redesigned that to where it's just a small tray, this tray, as opposed to that big flap they have there, which I don't understand why they did. But I never really had any issues in playing most formats connected to the old 790, so I wasn't too worried. And again, this plays well with the formats, and I'll show that real quick. So you can see I've got several movies listed here. I'm just going to pick one at random that I've got on my hard drive. Also, these same movies also stream just fine on the NAS as well. And I'm not going to go through all that, but I just wanted to show briefly that it does work in that respect. So no issues in terms of this particular player, at least so far, with most formats, video, music, or photos as far as that's concerned. Again, because of the location of the cable and this, again, as you can see, this big tray, sometimes that may get in the way, so you kind of have to be careful. Again, I'm not really sure why they made a small tray in the inside with one disc and have this big flap, flap, other than for looks, I guess. But I mean, it's okay. It's just that, again, it may have been a little less problematic with having a USB plugged in if it had a smaller tray design. Now, I personally like the interface of the 790 versus this X800, which uses, basically what Windows 8 kind of started, these big, large icons, or even a PlayStation 4 now uses similar things. I like the menu-driven, more of a menu-driven interface that the 790 has versus this. This seems a little crowded, and some things are not quite as easy to locate, in my opinion, versus the menu-driven, that 790 has. Maybe it's more of a personal preference, but again, it's just a lot easier for me to locate things in the menu-driven versus these with all these large icons that take up a lot of space. Now, one of the issues I had with the 790 is there would be at times, for example, that when you initially boot up the Blu-ray player on the 790, I would get some network errors. I've not had that issue with this. This particular, player connects to the network very quickly and has yet to get an error. And everything, for example, Netflix has worked just fine. I've had no issues with any network connections issues like the 790 has. I mean, there would be times with the 790 where I would have to do multiple attempts to retry with this player to connect to the network. I'm not really sure why that is, other than maybe the firmware wasn't completely worked out in the last few updates. But now, the one thing I do like about this versus the 790, it boots up a lot faster. Again, I have no connection issues like I've had with the 790. The apps load very quickly and work with no issues or pauses here. Now, again, I'm using, with this player, I have a cable modem with a Netgear R7000 AC router. So depending on what your setup is, your mileage may vary in terms of your speed and glitches and things like that. Because as it is with any electronics, it depends on all the different things you've got in your setup. The video on the apps are sharp. It streams well with no issues. It's got great sound. Of course, I've got mine run through a receiver, but I mean, what is pushing through from the Blu-ray player is very good, as is the video being sharp, including the 4K, which is awesome. Now, Blu-ray discs and DVD discs load quickly. I had no issues with that. The Blu-rays look great on the player. This has the ability to play ultra high def disc, but unfortunately Sony no longer includes some freebies with this player, so I haven't got to try that feature out, unfortunately, which is kind of a bummer, as they were previously offering a couple free UHD discs, which they no longer do. Now, the remote here, this is the remote for the X800. It has most of the essential stuff, including a Netflix button, which is, for those who like Netflix, works well. It quickly goes to that. The big thing about this remote versus the 790 is it's lost the number pad, which I don't really miss that much. I mean, maybe it's needed for some things, but I really don't miss it. And I haven't really noticed any missing buttons that would not be essential for this remote control. The remote is smaller, but to me feels a little flimsier than the old 790, which I guess that's just the tendency for manufacturers to try to make things a little bit lighter and cheaper if they can. But again, I didn't notice anything missing in terms of the buttons. You know, I can navigate through the menu quickly, you know, with the remote with no issues. It also plays nice with I have a Samsung 4K TV, which has a weird kind of remote. It plays nice with that TV, interfaces with the TV, and I can actually use the TV's remote to control most features of the Blu-ray player. So I do like that this has a Bluetooth feature, so you can connect wireless headphones or speakers or something like that to this as well, which is kind of a nice feature. I do think that this, at regular price, this player is $300. I think that's too expensive for this. However, if you can grab it on sale, I got mine at $149. It's currently, I think, around $200. It kind of jumps if you keep an eye out. You might get a deal at $149 again. Then I think it's worth it, even though the player's not quite perfect. Again, it has a quick, easy setup. You know, it immediately notifies you of the firmware updates. It has true 4K support, which is, you know, great, including 4K support for the 4K apps, which there are a few of those now. It does stream a variety of video, music, photo file formats. It recognizes my 3 terabyte Western Digital external drive. This one's a self-powered one versus one that's not powered. I'm not sure how that goes with one that doesn't have its own power supply. This one does, but I've had no issue with it recognizing it. It has an improved port here in the front, although, again, because of the design of the tray, it kind of gets in the way a little bit. It has a quick boot up time, quick network recognition. It works well with all the streaming apps I've tried. It seems to use the current versions of apps, at least as of now. It works well with a variety of Blu-ray, CDs, DVDs, UHDs of different kinds with no issues. It has a beautiful picture and sound, Bluetooth capability. It's a good, sturdy player, good quality, well-made player. And the one thing I haven't shown, which would be a little difficult here based on where I've got it, is that the player has, let me see if I can get it here, has 2 HDMI ports, which is a little hard to see, which is great. But again, it gives you the ability to put 4K, you know, connect directly to a 4K HDMI TV and connect to HDMI through your audio receiver. Again, the cons with this, the manual's a bit lacking, not a huge deal. The firmware update is a bit slow and takes you through the setup process again, which can be a kind of a hassle. Firmware updates may not keep up with the latest version of the apps over time, but that's based on my previous experience with Sony and the previous 790. Again, that's kind of probably a tendency what most manufacturers do now. Some file formats may not work reliably over the network or not at all. Again, the location of the port kind of gets in the way because of this big tray design here. The menu interface to me is a bit cluttered as opposed to more of a menu-driven interface. The bonus UHD discs from Sony are no longer part of the deal as far as buying this player. The remote is smaller and feels flimsier, and it has no number pad. That may be a big deal to some. There's limited app choices. Of course, you're at the mercy of Sony, what they decide they want to put on here. It has most of the, you know, common ones like YouTube, Netflix, Amazon. But again, you're at the mercy of Sony for that. There's also no front display here, really, other than a small power light that shows that it's on. And again, it's pricey at regular price. But overall, I like this player. It's working good for me so far. I give this X800 4 out of 5 stars, and I do think it's a worthy upgrade from the 3 to 4 year old S790 Sony Blu-ray player.